The fate of Emperor Valerian at the hands of the Persian Empire was far more horrifying than you can possibly imagine. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of human cruelty and the price of imperial hubris. This isn't just a story about an emperor's capture. It's about how the most powerful man in the known world became a living trophy, a human footstool, and ultimately met an end so grotesque that even hardened Roman historians struggled to record it. The year was 260 AD, and the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire echoed with the clash of steel and the desperate cries of legionnaires facing an enemy they had gravely underestimated. But on that fateful day in Edessa, a different sound would soon fill the air, the stunned silence of an entire army watching their divine emperor, the man they believed invincible, kneel in submission before a foreign king. What transpired in the years that followed was not merely an execution, but a systematic destruction of everything Romans held sacred about power, dignity, and death itself. Before we continue with this dark chapter of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our explorations into history's most haunting moments. The popular imagination has sanitized Valerian's fate into a simple battlefield defeat and execution. Roman propaganda later tried to minimize the horror, claiming he died quickly in captivity. But Persian sources and fragmentary accounts from Roman prisoners tell a far more sinister tale, one of prolonged humiliation, torture through luxury, and an end so symbolically devastating that it would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of how the master of the civilized world became a slave, and how his death became a warning written in gold and preserved in human skin. Publius Licinius Valerianus had ascended to the purple in 253 AD, at a time when the Roman Empire teetered on the edge of complete collapse. At 60 years old, he was already an elder statesman, respected for his administrative skills and senatorial dignity. Unlike many of his predecessors who had seized power through violence, Valerian commanded genuine respect. He stood tall and commanding, with the bearing of old Roman nobility, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and carrying himself with the gravitas that made lesser men instinctively bow. The Senate had practically begged him to take the throne, seeing in him the embodiment of traditional Roman virtues that might restore order to an empire plagued by civil wars, plague, and barbarian invasions. In those early days of his reign, Valerian seemed to justify their faith. He moved with decisive authority, appointing his son Gallienus as co-emperor to manage the western provinces, while he himself took command of the eastern frontiers. Contemporary accounts describe him reviewing troops in his purple cloak, the morning sun glinting off his gilded armor as thousands of legionnaires roared their approval. He restored discipline to armies that had grown soft and mutinous, executed corrupt officials who had been bleeding the provinces dry, and even managed to stabilize the currency that had been debased by his predecessors. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the empire had found its savior, but the Persian threat in the east demanded immediate attention. King Shapur, the first of the Sassanid Empire, had been systematically conquering Roman territories, and his armies had already sacked Antioch, one of the empire's greatest cities. Valerian gathered the largest force he could muster, 70,000 men, including the elite Praetorian Guard units, and marched east with absolute confidence. After all, he was leading Roman legions, the force that had conquered the known world. What barbarous Eastern king could stand against the might of Rome when led by an emperor himself? The transformation of Valerian from triumphant emperor to defeated captive began not with a dramatic battle, but with a series of cascading disasters that revealed the dangerous overconfidence of Roman leadership. As his legions marched deeper into Mesopotamia in the scorching summer of 260, they found wells poisoned, crops burned, and cities evacuated. Shapur was employing the ancient Persian strategy of scorched earth, drawing the Romans ever deeper into hostile territory while denying them supplies. Valerian, too proud to retreat and too committed to his campaign, pressed forward even as his men began falling sick from contaminated water sources and the merciless heat. Disease spread through the Roman camps with terrifying speed. Modern historians believe it was likely an outbreak of plague, possibly smallpox or measles, that devastated the tightly packed legions. Soldiers described watching their comrades' skin erupt in pustules, their bodies burning with fever as they writhed in delirium. The proud Roman military machine, so dependent on discipline and close formation fighting, became a liability as men infected each other in their crowded camps. Valerian himself, though not initially sick, watched his magnificent army wither away, not through enemy action, but through microscopic enemies he couldn't fight with swords or strategy. By the time the weakened Roman forces encountered Shapur's army near Edessa, they were already defeated in all but name. The Persians had fresh troops, superior cavalry, and most crucially, they had been watching the Romans deteriorate for weeks. Persian mounted archers, the nightmare of Roman infantry, circled the exhausted legions like vultures, pouring arrows into ranks too weak to maintain proper shield walls. The battle, if it could even be called that, was less a military engagement and more a systematic slaughter of men too sick and demoralized to fight effectively. It was at this moment of complete disaster that Valerian made the decision that would seal his horrific fate. Desperate to save what remained of his army, he agreed to meet Shapur for negotiations. The Persian king had sent messages suggesting terms could be arranged, that perhaps tribute could spare Roman lives. Some accounts suggest Valerian was advised against this by his officers, who remembered the fate of Crassus, another Roman general who had trusted Parthian negotiations. But Valerian, perhaps delirious from the early stages of the same sickness affecting his men, or simply seeing no other option, rode out with a small retinue to meet the Persian king. The meeting was a trap so obvious that later Roman historians could barely bring themselves to record it. As soon as Valerian entered the Persian camp, he was seized by Shapur's guards. The Emperor of Rome, the living god to millions of subjects, was dragged from his horse and forced to his knees before the Persian throne. Shapur, who had orchestrated this moment with careful precision, didn't immediately kill his prize. Instead, he did something far worse. He kept him alive. The immediate aftermath of Valerian's capture sent shockwaves through the ancient world. Never before had a Roman emperor been taken alive by a foreign enemy. The remaining Roman forces, witnessing their emperor led away in chains, simply dissolved. Some fled back to Roman territory with tales of the disaster, others surrendered and were enslaved. Many simply disappeared into the desert, preferring death to the shame of returning home without their emperor. Meanwhile, Shapur sent messages across his empire and beyond, announcing his incredible triumph. The man who claimed to be master of the world was now a Persian prisoner. What followed was not the quick death that Valerian might have prayed for, but years of calculated humiliation designed to break not just the man, but the very concept of Roman superiority. Shapur understood that keeping Valerian alive as a trophy was far more valuable than any ransom or military victory. Contemporary Persian inscriptions, carved in rock at Naqsh-i-Rostam, depicted the scene that would be repeated countless times. Valerian, still dressed in his imperial purple, but now soiled and tattered, forced to kneel before Shapur's horse and place his hands flat on the ground, creating a human mounting block for the Persian king to step upon when mounting or dismounting. The daily routine of Valerian's captivity was crafted to maximize psychological torture while keeping him physically capable of serving his humiliating purpose. He was kept in a special tent that traveled with Shapur's court, lavishly decorated with Roman eagles and standards captured from his legions, a constant reminder of his failure. He was fed well enough to maintain his strength, but forced to eat while wearing chains of gold, a mockery of his former wealth and power. Persian nobles would come to view him like an exotic animal, sometimes throwing coins at his feet to watch the Emperor of Rome scramble for them on Shapur's orders. The physical deterioration of Valerian during his captivity was carefully managed by his captors to keep him functional but progressively more pathetic. His hair, once carefully styled in the Roman fashion, grew wild and unkempt. His face, denied the daily shave that marked Roman civilization, sprouted a beard that the Persians would occasionally decorate with ribbons and jewels in mockery of Roman vanity. His hands, once soft from a lifetime of privilege, became calloused and scarred from his duties as a human footstool. Yet Shapur ensured he retained enough of his imperial appearance. The purple clothes, though filthy, were never replaced, so that everyone who saw him would know this wretch was indeed the Emperor of Rome. Contemporary accounts from Roman prisoners who survived their own captivity describe watching their emperor's progressive mental breakdown. Initially, Valerian had maintained some dignity, refusing to speak or acknowledge his captors beyond what was forced from him. But months of constant humiliation, of being displayed at Persian banquets like a performing animal, of hearing his empire mocked in languages he couldn't understand, gradually eroded his sanity. He began talking to himself in Latin, holding imaginary conversations with the Senate, issuing orders to legions that no longer existed. The Persians found this amusing and would sometimes pretend to follow his delusional commands before bursting into laughter. The most psychologically devastating aspect of Valerian's captivity may have been the news that filtered in about his empire's response to his capture. Rather than mounting a rescue mission or negotiating for his release, his son Gallienus had simply declared him dead and assumed sole rule. The Roman Empire had essentially erased him while he still lived, preferring to pretend he had died heroically rather than acknowledge the shameful reality. When Shapur informed Valerian of this, witnesses say the emperor wept for the first and only time in his captivity, not from physical pain, but from the realization that Rome itself had abandoned him. As years passed, the exact duration remains disputed, with accounts ranging from 3 to 7 years. Valerian's usefulness as a living trophy began to wane. He had become too broken, too pathetic to serve even as an effective symbol of Persian triumph. Shapur needed a more permanent monument to his victory, and what he conceived was a form of execution that would preserve the humiliation for eternity. The exact method of Valerian's death has been debated by historians for centuries, but the most consistent accounts describe a scene of calculated cruelty that shocked even an age accustomed to brutal executions. The Persian court had assembled for what Shapur announced would be a special celebration. Valerian, now possibly in his late 60s or early 70s, was brought before the throne one final time. Some accounts say he was forced to drink molten gold, a death that would symbolically mock Roman greed. Others describe him being flayed alive, his skin carefully removed to be later preserved and displayed. But the most detailed Persian account, recorded by a court scribe whose work survived in fragments, describes something even more elaborate. Valerian was slowly lowered into a large cauldron of boiling oil, not all at once, but gradually, allowing him to experience every moment of his flesh cooking away from his bones. The execution was conducted with the same theatrical precision that had characterized his entire captivity. The cauldron was placed where all could see, and Valerian was suspended above it on chains, his feet mere inches from the bubbling surface. The heat alone would have been agonizing, causing his skin to blister and redden before he even touched the oil. Then, with deliberate slowness, some accounts say it took nearly an hour, he was lowered inch by inch. The crowd watched in fascinated horror as the emperor's legs disappeared into the boiling liquid, his screams echoing through the Persian palace. What made this execution particularly horrific was not just the physical agony, but the symbolic meaning. Oil was precious in the ancient world, used for anointing kings and emperors. By boiling Valerian in oil, Shapur was performing a grotesque parody of imperial consecration. The Roman emperor, who had been anointed with sacred oils at his coronation, was now being anointed in the most horrific way imaginable. Witnesses reported that even hardened Persian warriors looked away as Valerian's flesh began to separate from his bones, the oil turning dark with rendered human fat. The crowd's reaction, as documented in various sources, ranged from triumph to revulsion. Persian nobles cheered their king's demonstration of power over Rome, but others, particularly Zoroastrian priests who valued ritual purity, were disturbed by the grotesque spectacle. Some accounts mention that several courtiers vomited at the smell of cooking human flesh that filled the palace courtyard. Children were reportedly hurried away from the scene, though not before many had witnessed enough to carry nightmares for the rest of their lives. The execution had achieved its purpose, creating a moment so shocking that it would be remembered and retold across the ancient world. But Shapur was not finished with Valerian even in death. After the emperor finally expired, and accounts differ on whether he died from the boiling, from shock, or from smoke inhalation, as some sources grotesquely note he was still trying to speak even as his lower body dissolved, his remains were subjected to further indignity. The body, or what remained of it after the boiling, was recovered from the cauldron. Shapur ordered that Valerian's skin, somehow partially preserved despite the oil, be removed, treated with straw and preservation agents, and formed into a grotesque mannequin. This horrific trophy was then painted red and dressed in the purple robes of a Roman emperor. It was placed in a prominent position in a Persian temple, where visiting Roman diplomats would be forced to see it before conducting any negotiations with the Persian court. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who challenge the King of Kings. The skin of a Roman emperor, stuffed like a hunting trophy, became a permanent reminder of Persian power and Roman vulnerability. Some accounts suggest that the preserved remains were later carried into battle against Roman forces, a psychological weapon as powerful as any siege engine. The treatment of Valerian's corpse revealed layers of symbolic meaning that went beyond simple cruelty. In Zoroastrian belief, the proper treatment of the dead was crucial for the soul's journey to the afterlife. By desecrating Valerian's body so thoroughly, Shapur was not just humiliating a political enemy, but attempting to damn his very soul. The emperor, who had claimed divinity in life, was being denied even the basic dignity of human death. Every aspect of the preservation and display was calculated to violate both Roman and Persian concepts of proper burial, creating a liminal horror that existed outside all cultural norms. The impact of Valerian's fate on the Roman psyche cannot be overstated. When news of his capture first reached Rome, the Senate had tried to suppress it, claiming he had died heroically in battle. But as traders and escaped prisoners brought back horrific details of his captivity and execution, the truth became impossible to hide. The psychological damage to Roman imperial ideology was severe. If an emperor could be reduced to a footstool and then boiled alive like a common criminal, what did that say about Roman claims to divine favor and universal dominion? The immediate political consequences were catastrophic. Gallienus faced numerous usurpations, as generals across the empire declared themselves emperor, each claiming they would avenge Valerian's humiliation. The empire fragmented into three parts: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the Central Roman State, a crisis that would take decades to resolve. The very legitimacy of imperial power had been called into question by the spectacular failure and horrific death of a legitimate emperor. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the historical record is what it doesn't tell us. Several Roman historians of the period seem to have deliberately avoided detailed discussion of Valerian's fate, as if the full truth was too shameful to record. Lactantius, writing a generation later, only briefly mentions that Valerian lived in shame under Shapur. The Historia Augusta provides conflicting accounts that seem designed to obscure rather than illuminate. This deliberate historical amnesia suggests that the trauma of Valerian's fate was so severe that Roman culture itself recoiled from fully acknowledging it. There are tantalizing gaps in the record that have led to centuries of speculation. A Persian ambassador to Rome decades later reportedly made reference to the Screaming Eagle, which some historians interpret as a nickname for the preserved remains of Valerian. Did the grotesque trophy survive for years or even decades after the execution? Roman sources are notably silent on whether any attempt was ever made to recover or properly bury whatever remained of the emperor. The absence of such accounts in a culture that placed enormous importance on proper burial rites suggests either that no remains were ever recovered, or that what was recovered was so horrific that it was quietly disposed of without ceremony. Modern archaeological evidence has added another layer of mystery to Valerian's fate. Excavations at Bishapur, one of Shapur's capital cities, have uncovered what appears to be a special prison complex with unusual features. Channels in the floor that some archaeologists suggest were designed to drain bodily fluids, and stone fixtures that might have been used to display human trophies. While no direct evidence of Valerian's imprisonment has been found, the structure dates to the correct period and shows signs of deliberate destruction, as if later Persian rulers wanted to erase evidence of what had occurred there. The medical aspects of Valerian's execution, when examined through modern understanding, reveal additional layers of horror. Being slowly lowered into boiling oil would have caused what medical experts call progressive thermal destruction. The feet and lower legs would have experienced immediate second and third degree burns, with nerve endings initially transmitting unbearable pain before being destroyed. As more of the body was submerged, the victim would have experienced systematic organ failure, with the boiling oil essentially cooking him from the outside in. The fact that some accounts mention he remained conscious and even tried to speak during the ordeal suggests the execution was calibrated to maintain consciousness as long as possible. The psychological profile of Shapur that emerges from his treatment of Valerian is equally disturbing. This was not a simple act of vengeance or even political calculation. The elaborate, years-long humiliation followed by the grotesque execution and post-mortem display suggests a deep understanding of psychological warfare and symbolic communication. Shapur seems to have recognized that destroying Roman military forces was less important than destroying Roman self-conception. By reducing their emperor to a subhuman state and then preserving that degradation for posterity, he struck at the very heart of what Rome believed about itself. The religious dimensions of Valerian's execution extend beyond the obvious violations of burial customs. Some scholars have suggested that the method of execution, boiling in oil, might have had specific religious significance in Zoroastrian symbolism, though the exact meaning remains disputed. Fire and purification were central to Persian religious practice, and the use of boiling oil, a corrupted form of purification, to execute an emperor who claimed divinity might have been intended as a form of theological commentary. The emperor who claimed to be a god was being proven all too mortal in the most visceral way possible. The ripple effects of Valerian's fate extended far beyond the Roman-Persian conflict. Other enemies of Rome took note of Persian success in not just defeating, but thoroughly humiliating Roman power. Germanic tribes, previously awed by Roman might, began to probe borders more aggressively. The psychological weapon that Shapur had created, the knowledge that Roman emperors were not invincible gods, but men who could be reduced to screaming, dying flesh, emboldened resistance movements across the empire. The careful mythology of Roman invincibility, built over centuries of conquest, had been shattered in the most spectacular way imaginable. Yet there remains a haunting question that historians have debated for centuries. Was the entire narrative of Valerian's boiling in oil accurate, or was it partially propaganda created by Shapur to maximize the psychological impact of his victory? The earliest and most detailed accounts come from Persian sources, which had obvious reasons to embellish their triumph. Some Roman sources mention different methods of execution or simply state that Valerian died in captivity without specifying how. This ambiguity has led some modern historians to suggest that while Valerian certainly died in Persian hands and was likely executed, the specific method might have been exaggerated or mythologized. However, the very fact that such extreme accounts were believed and transmitted speaks to a historical truth beyond the literal facts. Whether Valerian was actually boiled in oil, flayed, or forced to drink molten gold, the Roman world believed he suffered a death of unique horror. The psychological impact was the same, regardless of the precise method. Rome had to live with the knowledge that one of its emperors had died not as a warrior or even as a martyr, but as a humiliated captive whose death was turned into entertainment for a foreign court. The preservation of Valerian's remains, whatever form that took, created a unique problem for Roman diplomacy for decades afterward. Every embassy to the Persian court had to confront the physical evidence of Roman humiliation. Diplomats reported being forced to walk past the displayed remains before being allowed to present their credentials. This constant reminder of Roman vulnerability fundamentally altered the balance of power in negotiations. How could Rome negotiate as equals when the stuffed skin of an emperor watched over every meeting? The long-term consequences for the office of emperor itself were profound. After Valerian, emperors became notably more cautious about personally leading campaigns in the East. The office that had been built on military prowess and divine authority had been exposed as vulnerable to the most extreme forms of human degradation. Future emperors would need to rebuild not just military power, but the entire ideological framework of imperial authority. The fact that the empire eventually recovered and even thrived again under later emperors like Diocletian and Constantine speaks to Roman resilience. But the scar left by Valerian's fate never fully healed. Perhaps most disturbingly, some fragmentary accounts suggest that Valerian's execution was witnessed by Roman prisoners of war who were forced to watch their emperor's agony. These men, if they survived and eventually returned to Roman territory, would have carried with them memories that no amount of official propaganda could erase. They had seen their living god reduced to a screaming piece of meat, slowly dissolving in boiling oil. How could they ever again believe in Roman invincibility or imperial divinity after witnessing such a scene? The question of whether Valerian maintained any dignity or defiance in his final moments remains one of history's unresolved mysteries. Persian accounts naturally emphasize his complete breakdown and humiliation, describing him as begging for mercy and renouncing his titles in exchange for a quicker death. But a single Roman account, preserved only in fragments, suggests something different, that even as his body was being destroyed, Valerian continued to speak in Latin, possibly reciting Roman prayers or curses against his captors. If true, this would represent a last gesture of defiance, a refusal to be completely broken, even as his body was literally falling apart. The destruction of evidence relating to Valerian's fate appears to have been deliberate and systematic. When the Romans eventually reconquered some of the territories where he had been held and executed, they seem to have made efforts to destroy Persian inscriptions and monuments commemorating the event. Similarly, later Persian dynasties, perhaps embarrassed by the extreme cruelty of the execution or seeking better relations with Rome, may have destroyed or hidden evidence. This mutual conspiracy of silence has left historians piecing together fragments and possibilities rather than certainties. Modern forensic archaeologists have noted that if Valerian was indeed boiled in oil, his skeleton would show specific markers, particular patterns of bone damage caused by exposure to extreme heat while still living. The fact that no clearly identified remains of Valerian have ever been found leaves this question unresolved. Did Shapur ensure complete destruction of the body after preserving the skin? Were the remains eventually returned to Rome and quietly buried? Or do they still lie somewhere in Iran, waiting to be discovered and to finally confirm or refute the ancient accounts? The story of Valerian forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, mortality, and the human capacity for cruelty. Here was a man who had reached the absolute pinnacle of ancient world power, commanding legions, ruling millions, claiming divinity itself. Yet he ended his life as a tortured plaything, his very humanity stripped away layer by layer until only screaming meat remained. The transformation from emperor to footstool to boiled flesh represents a kind of anti-apotheosis, a reverse deification where a living god was systematically reduced to less than human. In our modern world, we often assume that certain boundaries of cruelty cannot be crossed, that civilization has progressed beyond such extremes. But Valerian's fate reminds us that when power structures collapse and cultural constraints disappear, human beings are capable of cruelties that challenge comprehension. The Persian court that watched and cheered as their enemies slowly boiled alive were not inherently different from us. They were people operating within a different framework of meaning, one where such spectacular cruelty could be justified as divine justice or political necessity. The legacy of Valerian's execution extends beyond its immediate historical impact. It became a cautionary tale about hubris, about the dangers of overextending power, and about the vulnerability that lies beneath even the most impressive displays of authority. Every emperor who came after had to reckon with the knowledge that the purple robes and divine titles offered no protection against the basic reality of human flesh and its capacity for suffering. The throne that had seemed like the ultimate achievement could become the prelude to the ultimate degradation. As we conclude this dark journey through one of history's most horrific executions, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. What were Valerian's final thoughts as he felt his flesh separating from his bones? Did Shapur ever regret the extremity of his cruelty, or did he go to his grave proud of having so thoroughly destroyed his enemy? And perhaps most hauntingly, what happened to the preserved remains? Some accounts suggest they were eventually destroyed by fire during a Persian civil war. Others claim they were hidden away and might still exist somewhere, a grotesque artifact of ancient cruelty waiting to be discovered. The story of Valerian serves as more than just a historical curiosity or a tale of ancient brutality. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it seems, is ultimately an illusion maintained by collective belief. When that belief is shattered, when an emperor becomes a footstool and then boiling flesh, the entire structure of authority can collapse. In Valerian's screams echoing through the Persian palace, we hear not just the agony of one man, but the death cry of an entire world view, a cosmic order torn apart by the brutal reality of human vulnerability. Today, as we sit comfortably distant from such extremes, it's worth pondering what modern equivalent of imperial purple might blind us to our own vulnerabilities. What contemporary claims to power and permanence might prove as fragile as Valerian's divine authority when tested by unforeseen catastrophe? The oil that boiled away his flesh has long since cooled, but the lesson remains burning hot. All power is temporary, all authority an illusion, and all human pretensions to divinity end in the same inevitable return to mortal flesh. Was Shapur merely executing a defeated enemy, or was he deliberately trying to destroy something far more significant, the very idea of Roman supremacy that had dominated the ancient world for centuries? Did the preserved remains of Valerian truly serve their intended purpose of deterring Roman aggression, or did they instead plant seeds of vengeance that would bloom in later Roman victories over Persia? And most mysteriously of all, why do Roman sources remain so notably silent about any attempt to recover or properly bury their emperor's remains? Was the shame too great, or was there simply nothing left to bury? If you found this exploration into one of history's darkest chapters compelling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the accounts of Valerian's execution were exaggerated for propaganda, or do you believe the ancient sources accurately captured the full horror of his fate? Your engagement helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light.